Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Cheryl, speaking to you from lovely Shure headquarters here in Niles, Illinois. And I am joined today by Gino and Chris, and they're going to be talking to us about how to specify a conference system with 10 easy questions. Doesn't get much easier than that, right, guys? Before we get into that, however, just a few items of housekeeping. This webinar will be recorded, as they always are, and you can find those at shure.com/training under the webinar archives link. We keep all of our past webinars there. This one will be up in about a week or so please feel free to go there, see all the information we've got. There's a lot of good learning to be done at shure.com/training. So, second of all, as we go through the webinar today, if you have any questions, please feel free to type those in the question pane in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. If you can't see that, just look for a little box that has an orange arrow and click on that to maximize that pane and ask any questions you have as we go through, and we will get to as many of those at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Gino and Chris. Take it away, guys.
Thanks, Cheryl. I just want to start by saying earlier today, it was actually 11 easy questions, but we decided that wasn't easy enough. So we cut one out and now we're down to 10 easy questions. So
it's one easier.
One easy. Ooh, good Spinal Tap reference. And thanks, Chris, for joining me here this afternoon.
Glad to be here.
Chris is one of our resident experts on conference and discussion systems, which is what we are going to discuss today. If you're not aware, a couple of years ago, Shure purchased the company known as DIS, or Danish Interpretation Systems, and brought their product line into the Shure product line. And they have been in the conferencing business for over 60 years. So quite a good history and experience there with that company that kind of came over to the Shure product line here. And so we've been now distributing the products in the Americas for a couple of years. And I think we've learned a few things in the meantime, and we're going to try to share with you what we've learned about these systems that will hopefully make it easier for you to specify the systems here. And that's really what it comes down to with these systems, the key element to making sure everything works and ultimately making sure we have happy customers in the long run is kind of finding out how the customer intends to use the system. And that's what most of these questions revolve around. A sort of common occurrence that we've gotten over in the systems support group is someone will send us a list of DIS equipment and say, does this look good? And say, sure.
Looks great.
But really, there's no way to really know if that's a complete quote. I mean, ultimately, that's what someone's looking for, is a complete quote. Like, is this a complete system that will do what the customer wants? And that's sort of the key question, right? Is what does the customer want to do? And then we can look at it and say, okay, you have all the right parts and pieces and you don't. These systems are extremely modular and very flexible, and they can do just about anything you want to do, but you really have to know what the end game is or what the intended usage is, so we can figure that out. So we'll spend a couple of minutes up front here talking about what these systems are. There's sometimes some confusion around these terms, conference and discussion, and what they mean. And then we'll look just real quickly at the Shure product lineup, which of course includes the DIS products, and then get into those 10 very important questions.
Right. And one thing we've learned, you spoke of things we've learned over the years, is there's really two kinds of sound systems when it comes to meetings. The traditional one is the sort of one-to-many format where you've got a presenter or maybe a panel discussion, but it's people up in the front of the room and they're talking to the people in the audience. So the sound is pretty much going in one direction. You mic the people at the front of the room. You orient your PA system so that the speakers are facing away from the microphones and toward the audience, and you're done. Works just fine. But in a lot of cases, depending on the format of the meeting, you might have more of a many-to-many arrangement where everybody is both a talker and a listener. Sort of everybody's a presenter. And it's further complicated in situations where the table is arranged in such a way that it's a circle or an oval or an elliptical shape so that everybody can see each other clearly. That makes it tough because now, if we put our PA system speakers on the outside wall of the room, they're facing in towards the microphones, which complicates our gain before feedback issues. So it becomes very difficult to construct a PA system and observe good practices of microphone and loudspeaker placement. And the real advantage fundamentally of conference and discussion systems is something very simple, that the microphone is right in front of the person speaking, the gooseneck mic, and the loudspeaker is directly in front of the user, very close to them also. And as we both know from our gain before feedback seminars that we've had in the past, if you want a great gain before feedback ratio, put the microphone close to the talker, put the loudspeaker close to the listener, and that's a great starting point to make everything work well. And it works great in this situation too. So that self-contained integrated PA system is one of the fundamental appealing factors of a discussion and a conference system. Who uses this stuff? Well, there's lots of examples where we talk about parliaments and Congress and the UN and things, but really it's much more widespread than that. Discussion and conference systems are used in lots of government and public agencies like city councils, school boards, associations, water districts, and so forth and so on. Any group that's got some sort of a governing organization or governing panel that has to meet regularly. Corporations and organizations are another big one. We all are familiar with sort of boardrooms in corporations, but don't forget that almost every industry group these days has an organization. Just for fun sometime, Google American Association of, and don't type in another word, and you will get hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of returns for everything from organizations of plumbing and heating contractors to dental hygienists and lawyers and doctors and everything in between. So there are lots and lots of organizations out there that are required to meet on a regular basis and report their outcomes to their constituent members. Then, of course, you do have parliaments and Congress and state governments and things like that. Those are always going to be there, but there aren't as many of them in most places. And the one a lot of people forget is temporary events. Lots of these big associations and trade organizations hold conferences once or twice a year or every couple of years where they actually meet and conduct business. And it's almost like a big shareholders meeting where, people speak, people vote, and there are lots of participants. And in some cases, these are thousands of people. So that's another place where the advantages of a discussion or conference system can really be a benefit. And it's worth talking about when we say discussion and conference, we're really making a fairly fine distinction here, but it's worth kind of pointing out. When we talk about a discussion, we're talking about a meeting where people get together to exchange ideas. And the structure of it is fairly informal. The speech is free-flowing. People get to talk whenever they want to. And really, the only rules governing the meeting are just standard professional behavior. When we talk about a conference, though, we're really using that term to carry with it an assortment of different constraints and ideas. One is that the purpose is sort of a threefold purpose. Number one, debate something. Number two, come to a decision or a resolution. And number three, document what was said and who said it and how they voted. So you're sort of responsible to the public or somebody to come to a conclusion and actually document it. The structure of these meetings is much more formal than a standard business meeting. Many times the speech and who will speak is actually planned in advance. You're going to cover certain agenda topics and you know who's going to speak about these. And in some cases, you might even require permission from the chairman to speak in the context of a discussion. The rules that govern them are similarly rigid. Sometimes it might be national laws. It might just be customs, or it could be just the standards or bylaws or regular rules of the organization. But it's usually a much more formal and structured sort of meeting when it's a conference as opposed to a discussion.
And I just like to point out, because I think it's a point of confusion here, particularly in the United States, with the word conference, because a lot of times when people hear that word, they instantly start thinking teleconference or video conference, which is those of us sitting in one room connected to people in another room or in another building or in another country and having our meeting that way. So it's by connecting different sites together to have a conference. And so people are thinking echo cancelers and codecs and that sort of a thing. And that is one type of conference system, but in the world that we're speaking about here, when we speak of a conference, it can be connected to these other rooms, but it's usually just about, being together in this one room and we are having a conference together. It doesn't necessarily, mean that we're connecting to another facility.
All right, so here's where we start talking about some of the terminology as far as the hardware goes. When we talk about a sound reinforcement system, we're all familiar with those. You've got sort of the basic arrangement of microphones, mixing and processing, amplification, and maybe some distribution to multiple loudspeakers or multiple zones. When we start talking about discussion and discussion systems, we're adding a little bit on top of that. You've got the basic sound reinforcement functions all there, but now we're adding more microphone control options so that it's not only about how the user themselves can activate the microphone, but maybe allowing remote activation by a chairman or an administrator. We've also got the ability to assign seats so that the system knows who is sitting in front of each microphone, so that when microphone number 3 is active, we know that that's John Jones talking. And then finally, a big component of discussion systems is interpretation. Although usually discussion systems offer some, but not a lot of interpretation capability. So you have a few languages, but not a lot. Now, when you start talking about a conferencing system, now we're talking about something that adds a whole extra layer of capabilities on top. So you've still got sound reinforcement. You've got all the features of a discussion system. Plus, we've added things like identification and seating verification. So we're not just talking about wanting to know who's assigned to a certain seat, but are they actually in that seat? And how do we know they're in that seat? In other words, taking electronic attendance. Then defining roles and privileges so that we have to know if people in certain seats or a certain section or members of a certain group have different roles or different privileges or different authority than other people in the group. Maybe they have extra voting power. Maybe they get to talk longer. Maybe they get to talk first. Another big thing is agenda management. With a conference system, you can pre-program certain topics into the system and say, these are the things we're going to talk about. This is the order we're going to talk about them. And in some cases, even say, and we're going to assign these people to do the talking. A thing that goes along with that is document management. Every agenda item might have some supporting documents or diagrams or maybe a video or a hyperlink that people need to look at in the context of listening and talking about that item. So the system allows you to incorporate documents and distribute them to all the participants. Another big part of a conference system that distinguishes it from a discussion system is voting and polling. So we're talking here about electronic voting, meaning that everybody can somehow push a button to cast their vote and the system logs that in so we know who voted and we know how they voted. And polling is just a variation on voting where instead of saying yes, no, you're saying, I like this choice instead of that choice. Maybe here are 5 different options. Which one do you like the best? And finally, external display, especially when you start talking about larger groups, you've got some information that either needs to be distributed to people directly at their seats or needs to be put up on a big screen, such as who's the current speaker, or what is the current agenda item, or what's a document that we all need to see, or what were the results of the last vote. External display capability allows you to configure how that visual information is shown. So when we talk about actual products that Shure makes here, it actually falls into line pretty nicely. In sound reinforcement, we've got things like MXW, Microflex, Centriverse, gooseneck mics, boundary mics, and so forth. Sometimes might be used with an automatic mixer like the SCM-A20. When we move into a discussion system, we're talking about the DDS 5900, which is designed to be a discussion system, although you could use the DCS 6000 conference system because it'll do everything that a discussion system will do, certainly. And when you move into a true conference system with all those extra capabilities, that's when you really want the DCS 6000. It's designed with a modular approach so that all of those different capabilities can be implemented, configured, and customized exactly in the right way to meet exactly the specific needs of the user.
And you can do all of that with only 6 easy pieces. And actually even maybe less than that because some of them are optional. But this is kind of a good way to look at these systems too, sometimes an advantage that, it's not maybe clear from what we've just talked about so far, but is how simple they are to get set up and working, particularly in a portable application where you need to get a sound system up and running very quickly. There's no dragging in power amps and loudspeakers and mixers and all this other kind of stuff, because you can have a functioning discussion system up and running with just the central unit, some cabling, and the delegate units, and that's all it takes to get a system up and running. So in any of these discussion or conference systems, you're always going to have one central unit, which is really kind of the brains of the operation. That's the rack mount piece that kind of runs and powers the whole system. So the delegate units do not have to have power run to them or batteries put in them or anything like that. They simply tap all of their power off of the central unit. And then it connects together using shielded Cat5e or Cat6 cable. I'll say that again, shielded Cat5e or Cat6 cables. We don't want to see any plastic connectors in any of these.
Are the ones at Walgreens shielded? I don't think they
do
are.
They sell those at Walgreens?
I don't think they are. No.
And it sounds like we're kind of, beating the horse here a little bit, but this is kind of a big deal with these systems, actually. I mean, I know it a lot of times people go, oh, great, Cat5, we got tons of that stuff rolled up in the back here or whatever. But yes, that's true, but this is a little different than hooking up, your network at home, or even a network in an office somewhere that's purely relying on data. Because when you're talking about unshielded cabling in these types of systems, or even compromised cabling, you can get away with a lot more on a data network, a lot more mistakes, because if a packet gets dropped, you send it again, But when you're talking about real-time audio communication, packet loss becomes a much bigger problem. You don't want to have data getting corrupted on the line, because that basically makes the system not function. We actually highly encourage using the pre-made DIS cables, which of course are available through Shure now, because they are not only tested, but they're actually certified, which is different from just, getting your cable checker out and checking for continuity. There's actually a certification standard for these cables, and they have to be certified cables in order to work with the system. So, not to knock anybody's ability to make cables or anything like that, but more often than not, when someone has a problem with these systems, we say, did you make your own cables? Yeah. Okay. Try one of our cables. Does it work now? Yeah. Okay. So, that's just something to keep in mind when you're looking at these systems. At least for the patch cables that interconnect the delegate units, we highly recommend using our pre-made cables on that. Okay. That soapboxes. I'll get off that now and move on. So going down to the optional things there, if there's interpretation happening in the system, then you would want to get interpreter sets, of course, to translate into the other languages. Then you can add an infrared audio distribution system so that attendees can listen to different languages. So you can use the infrared system there to broadcast however many languages you might happen to have going on, and then participants can wear the infrared receivers. That's kind of for listen-only participants. All of the delegate units have a headphone jack on them. I shouldn't say all of them, but the vast majority of them have a headphone jack on them, so you can listen to the different languages. But for people in the gallery section, they might use the IR system for that. And then, of course, the big one is adding the software. All of the DIS systems have an embedded browser-based GUI that gives you some limited microphone control and setup capabilities, but on the 6000 series, the SW6000 software really expands the capabilities to get into most of those higher level functions that Chris was talking about. When you're looking at a true conference system, are kind of unlocked when you add in SW6000 to the equation. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on the differences between our two systems here. There's actually an archived webinar on our website that kind of goes through a little more detail on these two systems. But when you're looking at the DDS, which the D for the middle D being for discussion on the 5900, or DCS 6000 conference system, it really comes down to three things. First one, how many units do you need? The 5900 supports up to 250 conference units for one system, with the 6000 up to 3800. That's a big deal. The second thing is, how many languages do you need? Again, the 5900 gives you some limited interpretation capability for 2 languages. 6000 can support up to 31 interpretation languages. And then one of the biggest thing too, which is kind of listed here as a complete meeting management tool, which is true. A lot of that comes down to, do you need to vote or not? Because there are many applications, particularly again in the US, where 250 units is more than enough, right? We don't maybe even need interpretation at all, but we need voting. you're in the 6,000 series. So that's always an important question to ask. If someone, buys one of these systems under the assumption that they're going to vote with it, but they buy the 5,900 to save a little bit of money, they're going to end up out of luck there. So that's something that's worth investigating.
We should point out too, voting means different things to different organizations. If you want to do just simple voting where people push a button and the system shows the chairman that, all right, 6 people voted yes, 2 people voted no, but you don't know who voted how, that might be sufficient. But in a lot of cases, it has to get a little bit more structured than that. And what we're really talking about is not only adding up the votes, but calculating whether or not the measure passes using some sort of predetermined formula that you can enter. And it also means knowing who voted, which means the system needs to know who's who and who's where. And it also means what were they voting on so that we can assign votes to a particular topic. So really, we talk about voting like it's a standalone feature, but really it's very closely tied with the whole concept of having the delegates logged into the system and also having the agenda logged into the system. Those 3 things all kind of go hand in hand. But sometimes it's hard to know what people really want.
Oh my, did we just work 2 Spinal Tap references into a discussion and conferencing webinar?
Which means we only need a couple of more and we're good. So, we've all dealt with clients where, they say they want a sound system, but they have a real hard time articulating exactly what it is they want and need because they don't really know what's possible. They don't know the language. So you have to sort of sometimes dig and prod and poke in order to get enough information out of them to figure out what is it they really want to do and how do they want to go about it. If it would be great if we had the luxury of sitting in on some of their meetings to find out how they run their business, but that's not always possible. So sometimes they'll be very clear and say, here's the bid specification. This is exactly what I'm looking for. But lots of times it's not anywhere near that clear. So we've come up with a list of 10 questions that you can ask a client when specifying a discussion or conference system to get a much better idea of exactly what things do you need and not need, and hopefully avoid surprises later. So let's take a look at those. Question number 1, the big one. How many people? This is really an important question, probably the most important. And not only how many people are there, whether it's 20 or 40 or 100 or whatever, but are they all the same people or are there different types of people in this meeting? Is there a chairman and 12 council members, or are there 5 vice presidents and a CEO and then 10 directors? Do these people have different roles, different privileges, different functions? Maybe some people talk all the time and some people only speak occasionally. There are all kinds of little wrinkles like that. Some of you may have dealt with rooms where there's a big round conference table and you got 20 people around the table, but then there's also a ring of seats around the exterior of the room. And those people mostly listen, but once in a while they might need to talk. So you need to figure out, how do I deal with these people who have sort of different amounts of level of participation in the meeting?
And I'll point out too that sometimes how many people you have doesn't necessarily translate into how many delegate units you need, because you can support 2 delegates per station in some of these applications too. So again, you definitely need to know how many people you have, but then look at the units you're considering and decide, like, okay, then how many conference units do we need, again, based on how they want to run their meeting. So you have to, again, dig a little bit and find out, is that okay, or does everybody need to have their own specific unit? These are all good questions to ask. So speaking of talking with them about how they intend to use the system, again, this is a big one here, because there are a number of different ways that the user can interact with the microphone. And it may sound like kind of a bizarre question, because it's like, how to interact with them? I talk into it. That's how I interact with the microphone. But these systems offer many different modes of operation that can be selected based on, again, how the user wants to run their meeting. The way, I think, again, to be kind of United States centric, we're sort of used to running meetings as, well, everybody's microphone is just on, or it turns on automatically and I don't have to do anything about it. And that certainly is a capability of these systems. But in some of these more managed meeting type situations, you might want to choose one of these other modes. The most basic and I think easy for people to understand is what would be a push to talk type system, what we refer to as automatic mode on our systems, which means I push the button when I want to talk and the microphone automatically turns on. But that's a basic push to talk system. And on the DIS systems, you can have up to 8 microphones open at a time, or you can select that to be some number less if you'd like it to. But it's never more than 8. And then once the maximum number of open mics is reached, if somebody else tries to turn on their microphone, they simply can't until somebody else turns off one of their microphones, and then that opens up a space for somebody else to come on and talk. The really super organized way to run a meeting, or what we call manual mode, is really like a request to speak mode, where when you have something to say, you push a button and that puts you into the queue. And then the chairman or a technician who's running the meeting decides when your microphone gets to be turned on. They activate the microphone. And then when you're done speaking, you can either turn your microphone off or they will turn it off for you and hand over the floor to the next person that's in the queue. So it's very much a one at a time, organized. Someone who's in charge is going to let you know when it's your turn to talk. You can request to speak, but you can't actually speak until you're given permission. And then kind of a hybrid of the two is something that's referred to as FIFO. So first in, first on is one way to think of it, where it's sort of like automatic mode. But once the maximum number of open microphones is reached, the next person that pushes their speak button gets put into a queue, and they wait until somebody turns their microphone off. And then once that happens, the person who is in the queue, their mic automatically turns on. So it's like queuing without having to have the chairman turning the microphones on all the time. It just kind of happens more automatically. And then finally, of course, there's what we would call Vox mode, or is a voice activated mode here, which again is just kind of a basic sort of noise gate for people who want completely hands-off operation. The microphone just turns on when you speak and turns off when you're done speaking. Again, never more than 8 microphones can be active at a time in that mode.
All right, question number 3. How will the system know who's who? In other words, does the system know who's speaking and where they're sitting? You can do this in a couple of different ways. One is for people to have assigned seats. For instance, in a city council situation or a courtroom, people sit in certain places. The judge always sits at the judge's bench. The witness is always in the witness box. Same with the city council, it might be that way. So you can have assigned seats so that when microphone 3 turns on, we know that is council member Smith because he's in that seat. Or you could have it set up so that they log in either using a PIN code or even like a smart card, chip card thing where they slide a card into a slot in the side of the microphone. That way, they can theoretically sit anywhere that they want, and the system knows by the PIN code or the chip card where are they and who are they. And that can be important because that way, when they are speaking, we know who's speaking. And when people cast votes, we know who it was that cast that vote. In some situations, you might not need this. It might not be important for the system to have any awareness of who's where, and so you can always deactivate this if you don't need it. But in a lot of situations, it can be really important to not only verify attendance and attribute votes, but just to track speech time and that sort of thing. So how the system knows who's who can be an important one.
And again, I think we talked a little bit earlier pretty completely about the application, but again, it's worth stressing that you want to find out if they're going to vote with the system, number one, because it determines which system they're going to get, but also how they plan to vote determines which physical components you choose, as well as what software options you might need to choose as well. For example, within the 6000 series, there's units where you can vote via touchscreen, like is pictured here. There's units that just have, yes, no, abstain, and then the extra 2 buttons for the polling application, so that there's no touchscreen, but just physical voting buttons. Or maybe they want to vote through the software. Maybe every council member has their own computer that's hooked up to the system and they just vote via the software. Again, that's all kind of worth finding out, how they want to vote. And then Other things to ask, who needs to see the results? Is it just the chairman? He can see that on the touchscreen unit just by himself, or anybody that has a touchscreen can see it. Or maybe you want to put up a big giant display and have the voting results shown on the display. That's another capability of the system, but you need to know that first. Do you want to be able to store the results of what you're voting? Do you want to vote on specific agenda items? Do you want to be able to go back through, old meetings and see who voted specifically on what topics? Again, these are all good things to ask. And, if you're not familiar with the architecture of the SW6000 software, it's very modular. In other words, you don't just buy one thing and get it all and just configure it how you want. You kind of have to know ahead of time what you want to use so that you purchase the right modules. I think nothing is probably more frustrating for a client is that when they get the system commissioned and they're ready to start going and they say, oh, by the way, we want to do this. And you go, well, you didn't pay for that. Oh, you didn't tell me I had to pay for that, so it's always worth stressing even ahead of time, even when they think they've decided, just so that customers know, hey, if you decide to add anything else or change anything from what we've already specified here at the last minute, that may be another module you're going to have to purchase. It doesn't just come with everything. So again, these questions are all good things to try and figure out as early as possible.
And there's also lots of other little things you can program into with the software on the 6000 system. Like you can have different people's votes have different weights. So the president's vote can count double. Or if it's a Fortune 500 company and it's a stockholders meeting, the weight of votes might need to be coordinated with how many shares people own. You could also set it up so that different agenda items have different formulas for deciding does the vote pass or not. Maybe on one item, it's a simple majority. Maybe on a different item, it has to be a 3/5 majority. You enter that information in the system, and then it calculates knowing whether or not the system passed, the vote passed, based on the correct formula. All right. Do they need interpretation? This is an important one in many parts of the world, maybe not something we always think about here in the States, but certainly for our friends up in Canada. And the important question is, how many languages do they need? Is it just, 2 languages, 3, 10? If it's truly an international, global type of conference, it might be 30 languages or so. And of course, there are some logistical issues too, like where will the interpreter sit? They do need to be isolated from the rest of the conference members. So that means they're either in their own special room or perhaps in temporary booths set up at the back of the conference room. And typically there are 2 interpreters per language. So you need to accommodate both of them so that they can, relieve each other when they need to take a break. And the interpretation can get a little more complicated if you've got many languages, and some of the languages are perhaps a little more unique or a little less common. And in cases like that, the interpreter system can do something called relay, where an interpreter who speaks Croatian might be able to translate from Croatian into English, but not from Croatian into German. So what happens then is they translate from Croatian into English, but then the German interpreter listens to the English translation and translates that into German. And you can do that with up to 5 levels. They call that a relay. So the 6000 interpreter system is quite advanced and gives you lots of capabilities for interpreters to manage the interpretation services.
Is there an audience? And a lot of times in a lot of applications, there's a gallery section of people who need to listen to what's going on in the meeting. They don't necessarily need to participate, but maybe they just need to hear. How are they going to hear? You want to just put up an external PA system for them to hear? That's fine. These systems have an audio output line level that can be connected to an external sound system if needed. Again, headphones can be used for listening to the floor audio. Actually, you could put up these infrared systems to distribute just the floor audio, which means the main language that the system is run in. Or if there's interpreted languages, again, you can use the multiple audio outputs that are available from the systems and connect them multiple channels to the infrared radiator so that the receiver can be used to select the different languages that someone might want to listen to. Another way to distribute the language channels too are to have little what they call channel selector pieces that can be built into the armrests of chairs that are just a headphone jack with a channel selector buttons on it, and anybody can sit down there, plug in headphones, and choose whichever language they want to listen to. So there are many different ways that you can distribute audio out to the audience. And if the audience needs to participate, maybe they're not regular meeting participants, but maybe they take questions from the audience or the gallery or something, you can have separate podiums set up for that. Those can be made part of the system as well. So there's a couple of different ways that you can integrate the audience if needed.
And finally, the actual hardware itself, in some cases, we've got a choice of portable or flush mount units in both the 5900 and the 6000 product line. And this kind of comes down to what's the room decor? Is it tables that are moved around? Is it tables that are fixed? Are these new tables, old tables? How much drilling and cutting do they want to do, and so forth? Portable units can certainly be permanently mounted if they don't need to actually be moved around or put away. Flush mount units give you a little bit more of a finished appearance, but obviously require more cutting and intrusion into the tabletop. And there are quite a selection of flush mount units with voting buttons or without, with language buttons and without, with chip card reader and without. So there's plenty of different sizes and feature variations to accommodate pretty much whatever the customer is going to want. But in most cases, that kind of comes down to how do they want the equipment to integrate into the room design.
One thing we haven't really mentioned yet, but kind of comes into play here in particular, is how customizable the 6000 series is, even beyond what's just sort of kind of available in the standard choices, particularly when you get into flush mount units. If someone looks at that and says, I really like that, but I wish it was brushed aluminum instead, we can do that. I wish it was a little smaller or more square instead of rectangular, we can do that. I want that one, but I don't want channel selectors on it, you can do that too. Lots of things can be done. However, got to wait longer and pay more money. But anything is possible on the system given enough lead time. So it's very, very customizable to meet the specific user's needs. Knowing the layout and the size of the room is important, because one of the most common questions we get is how many delegate units can I hook up to the central unit? Well, the answer is it depends. It depends on which conference units you have. It depends on how long the cable runs are. It depends on how many different chains you need to run. All of these impact that question. So we really do need to have a good idea of where these things are going to be physically located in the room. I mean, with the 5900 series, for example, in general, you can hook up to about 60 delegate units to one central unit. But if the cable runs start getting longer, that number goes down. So the more units you want to hook up, then the more you have to pay attention to what your cable runs are, or think about adding external components like power supplies and repeaters and whatnot. So you'll notice earlier on, I said the 5900 can support up to 250 delegate units, but that's off of one CU with additional power supplies. If you don't have those additional power supplies, you're limited to somewhere between 50 and 60. So again, there's power supplies, repeaters, there's extension boxes that sort of combine the functions of both power supplies and repeaters. These are things that we can help you with when it comes to design. There's some guidelines in the user guides that sort of give you an idea of, okay, you're using this unit, you've got this long of a feed cable, and your patch cables are this long, you can use this many units or whatever. But you kind of have to extrapolate that a little bit. There's no very cut and dry. You kind of have to look at it. But there's a lot of power going down the cable to get all these units powered up. So you really do have to pay attention to these things, as well as how the cables are going to be run. In a simple configuration, you can run everything in one chain directly off the central unit, all daisy chained together. But in some rooms, the cabling may not allow for that, depending on how the tables are set up, or if there's a dais up front and then other units in the corner somewhere, or whatever it happens to be, you might have to run multiple chains out there. So it's very important to take a good look at the room layout and figure out how you're going to run your shielded Cat 5e or Cat 6 cable.
Do you work for a shielded cable company? Is that it?
Kickbacks.
All right, number 9, how do they want to control the system? And this kind of comes down to not only how are they going to want to use it during a meeting, but also how do they want to set up meetings before the fact. So there's basically 3 choices here. They can operate the unit from the conference unit itself, where they don't really do a lot of advanced setup, and maybe everything is controlled from the touch panel on the unit itself. If they want to get a little bit more in depth, they can use the browser GUI on a tablet computer or PC, where they can enter delegate names, run votes, and do things like that. If they want to get into some of the more elaborate features, they're probably going to be running dedicated software on a PC. It's also worth asking them who's going to enter participant information, agenda subjects, document links, voting formulas, and all that sort of thing, and where are they going to do that from? Because if there's going to be an administrative PC, for instance, that's used to set up conference information in advance, will that be done inside the conference room at a PC, or will that be done by an administrative person at a different PC in their office? You just need to make sure you know how many PCs need to be running the software, need to be all networked together and so forth, so that you don't find out at the last minute that, oh, the person actually configuring the meeting is actually down the hall and around the corner, and that's going to be a 300-foot run. That's something you need to make sure you figure out in advance.
And then finally, any external AV requirements. So we kind of already talked about the need for, feeding the audience from a PA system. Maybe you need to connect to a video conference system to be able to bring in other remote locations to participate in your meeting. That can be done with external equipment. Some very common request as well. We have a main guest presenter that just needs to use a wireless microphone. That's great. There's an audio input to be able to, get external audio sources into the system. You can get into recording, streaming, and archiving. Those are all, different data that can be exported from the meetings and imported into those kinds of systems. Sometimes even started and stopped from within the software. So again, these are all, just things worth finding out, if someone wants to do it, and if they do want to do it, how does it get implemented? So kind of maybe a more minor point at the 10th one here, but still something that's worth talking about. So all that's to say, if you need help with any of these topics, we have a group here at Shure that is dedicated to helping support all of our sort of conferencing and integration type products. That's the Systems Support Group, which you can email at systemsupport@shure.com or call the phone number there, and we'll be happy to help you out with this stuff. In fact, we prefer that you do. Again, there's nothing more frustrating, I think, for everyone than when someone is on site going, well, the customer, they want to do X, Y, Z, and I know the system can do it. And we look at it and go, yeah, but you didn't buy the components to make X, Y, Z happen. So, give us a chance to help you out, and we'll make sure that everything works out correctly. Cheryl?
All right, great. Lots of great information. And I would sort of reiterate what Gino just said. Write down that number if you're working with these systems, because those guys know what they're doing and you probably will need their help. So anyway, we will have another webinar later this month to be determined. But what you can do is you can go to shure.com/subscribe, and there you can sign up for our weekly newsletter. And in that weekly newsletter will be information about future webinars. So you can kind of stay clued into what's coming up next and join us for all of our other great learning opportunities. So once again, this will be archived at shure.com/training. So feel free to peruse over there. And we want to thank you so much for joining us. We only have one question, guys.
Hope it's a good one.
It's a good question. The guy at point number 10 slide looks like Chris Lyons' brother. Is that your brother, Chris?
No, it is not my brother, although I agree.
Wow, you're actually dressed like
He is wearing
I
that
am wearing
outfit.
exactly that outfit, yes, although no microphone. But I agree.
That is the official conferencing system uniform.
That looks like a cross between me and Aaron Hartman.
So that's all we have for questions. So I guess you guys covered everything else. Thanks so much for joining us, and we will see you next time.